Okay, so we're back, and this is going to be the final segment of our chapter. And in this beginning, let's talk about performance appraisal research and participation as the topic here. What we're talking about here is self-assessment or expressing ideas during the appraisal. So we're talking about whether the rater is really participating in the appraisal and getting to contribute their own assessment or sharing their own ideas about the situation. So down here in the bottom, I've got a little circle, employee participation in the performance appraisal process. When employees get to participate in the performance appraisal process, they tend to experience more satisfaction with the process and with the session that they've engaged in where they're getting feedback from their supervisor. So participation boosts satisfaction. So including employees, even if the self-assessment is not weighted very heavily in the overall, performance appraisal, the fact that the employee got to contribute their own insights into how they've been doing, or if they got to offer maybe some examples of behaviors that they would like included in the performance appraisal or something like that, it boosts satisfaction. Being involved leads to motivation to improve as a result of the appraisal. So when an employee got to reflect, got to offer ideas of behaviors, that kind of thing, it makes them more likely to want to improve, which is really the goal of performance appraisal, right? We talked about that earlier, the idea that we are doing these performance appraisals because we want development of the employee. So we want them to be motivated to improve. When they get to participate, they tend to think that the process is fairer. If they are sort of just delivered with this appraisal and they're just told, this is what I see and this is what you need to change, it makes it a lot harder to swallow, right? So if the appraisal is offered and the employee gets to, share some insights and it goes back and forth like that, the employee is going to feel like it was fair, they were heard. And then also it's going to contribute to them feeling like the whole thing was useful. Like it was a useful expenditure of their time, right? A lot of times people don't want to do performance appraisal because they're like, oh, it's taking away from work I could be doing. But finding out how you've been doing, what you could do to improve, what things you should continue to do because we really like them, those are important pieces of information. And so if the employee gets to participate in the whole process rather than just being dictated to, they're going to internalize the usefulness a lot more. All right, what about knowledge of the appraisal system? So, knowing as an employee what's going on. I'm sorry, my allergies are killing me, man. So, perceived system knowledge. Employees' understanding of the performance appraisal system is an important contextual variable. Okay, so understanding the system, right? Understanding the system of appraisal is a really important factor in the employee feeling like this appraisal makes sense in the context, right? The supervisor is a lot less likely to display leniency in their ratings when employees understand the appraisal system. So sometimes leniency might be being displayed by raters because they know that the employees are going to be blindsided by this feedback. So if they know that the employee really understands what was expected of them, what they were going to be rated on, that the employee really understands what the system is, the supervisor is going to feel a lot more empowered to make rational, objective ratings. They aren't going to feel like, I'll just give everybody 5s because they don't even know what's going on anyway. It wouldn't be fair. They're a lot more likely to give honest ratings. And then perceived system knowledge is positively related to job attitudes and appraisal reactions. So from the ratee side, for the employees, their job attitude tends to be better. They tend to react to their appraisal better when they know what the appraisal system is, when they know what they're being rated on and they know how they're going to be rated. They feel just overall better about it. So it's really important to let employees know from the get-go. Maybe even show them one of the forms that are used for rating employees. A lot of times they'll be included in the employee handbook, so that employees know from the very beginning, from the time that they're hired, these are the qualities that you're going to be appraised on. These are the things we're looking for. These are the behaviors. These are the quantities of whatever that we need to see, so that employees know for a fact what they're working toward. Wish I had one of those little cough buttons, but I don't. This isn't real radio. This is just a professor in her home office. All right, the feedback process. So we've got attend to the feedback, processing the feedback, using the feedback. So we've got that meeting where we're going to sit down and the appraisal is going to be delivered to the appraisee, right? So we need the appraisee to pay attention to the feedback. We need them to process the feedback. What does this mean? What does this mean for me? What does this mean for the behaviors that I've engaged in? And then we need them to ultimately use that feedback to improve their performance going forward. So factors that affect the effectiveness of the feedback. Could I say effect and effectiveness right next to each other? Sorry. I shouldn't make myself laugh. Factors affecting feedback effectiveness. So the feedback environment and then the feedback orientation are the two big factors. And so when we talk about the environment, we're talking about the organization's climate and attitude towards feedback. So how trustworthy is the source? Is my supervisor actually a credible rater of my behavior? If you have somebody who comes sort of blowing through to do all the evaluations of the employees and then they move on to the next district or whatever, that's not going to be a very credible source. Somebody who has seen your behavior day in and day out, who's been there, who has interacted with you, you're going to feel like is a much more credible source. Feedback quality gets at that issue of explaining the ratings. If you're just given a series of numbers and you don't know what to do with them. I've had that kind of feedback provided where it was just ratings and I literally didn't even know what the top score was. All I knew was, this is the number I got. And I'm like, out of what? Like, if this is out of 10, this isn't a bad number. If this is out of 100, this is horrible. Like, what? Out of what? That was not a very high quality feedback. Being provided with information that'll actually fill in blanks and stuff like that, that's high quality feedback. And then feedback delivery. Again, putting it in an envelope and putting it in the employee's mailbox at work is not great feedback delivery. Sitting down, going over the material, explaining things, asking for questions, having a give and take, that's good feedback delivery. Oh, I wanted to say something about that though, because the organization's climate and attitude towards feedback. When an organization devotes part of the paid workday, at least once a year, twice a year, something like that, to assessing feedback, assessing performance and giving good quality feedback, it's going to boost credibility for one thing, but it's going to set this whole climate of growth, investment, inclusion, like all the things that an organization wants to communicate to its employees that it wants to keep, the ones that it wants to keep. Those are all the messages that those employees want. So it's really super important that an organization actually have a structure devoted to performance appraisal that is really obviously giving the message, this is important. We want to invest in you and we want you to improve and grow with us. Feedback orientation. This is the individual's overall receptivity to feedback, right? And some people are going to be more receptive to feedback than other people, but on average, most people are going to, be receptive. Now, what will boost receptivity is when the receiver perceives the feedback to be useful, right? If they feel like, okay, this feedback includes an action plan for things that I could do going forward that would improve my performance and, make me more valuable to my organization. Feeling accountable to use the feedback. If there's, again, in part of that action plan and we're going to check back in 3 weeks and see if you have instituted this schedule strategy that we talked about, or this record keeping strategy that we talked about, or, we want to be able to see that you're actually doing the things that we asked you to do, or that we, suggested that you needed to do. So accountability is a big part of receptivity. Social awareness through feedback, right? So oftentimes people don't realize that their behaviors are impacting other people on the work, in the workplace. So letting an employee know that the music that you're listening to in your cubicle is disturbing other people, that when you don't get your part done in time, then that means that the next employee who's depending on your part being done can't get their part done, right? Like sometimes people are tardy or lackadaisical or whatever because they really don't think about the fact that they're impacting other people, that there's a whole chain of behaviors that are going to happen, and you're breaking the chain. So providing some of that kind of social awareness of the impact that they're having on their coworkers and things like that on a whole variety of topics are really important for feedback. And it, if you help a person to boost their social awareness, see their place in the organization, see the role that they're playing, that kind of thing, that can boost their receptivity to feedback. Self-efficacy in dealing with feedback. So if a person feels like they have the ability to implement the feedback that has been provided, like they actually could do it, they're going to be much more receptive to the feedback than if they feel like, well, how am I going to do that? I don't have the skills. I don't have the tools that I need. I don't have the budget that I need, right? If the person feels like I can't implement what you've suggested, they're going to be very unreceptive to the feedback because they're going to feel like they've almost been set up for failure. The feedback is you need to do this, that, and the other thing. The reality is I can't do this or that. And as a result, the other thing is out of the question, right? So if the person's feeling self-efficacious, where they feel like they actually have a chance of being able to do it, that they have the skills or the tools that they need, they're going to be much more receptive to the feedback. And so again, that's something that the rater could have an impact on, right? Because if you're delivering information about how I need you to get these tasks done by the 15th of every month, and the person is thinking in their head, well, how am I going to get that done by the 15th of the month when I have all these other tasks that I'm barely getting through by the 15th of the month? How am I going to pile that in on top? A good rater will give information about how that would be done. So for example, every afternoon we're going to have a 1 hour devoted to this activity, or we'll have a weekly team meeting to make sure that we're making headway on it, or something to make sure that the person feels empowered. We've bought you the software that will really simplify this, or, whatever, so that the person feels like they have the tools, the ability, and the, wherewithal to actually accomplish the feedback that they've been provided with. Favorable feedback environment has been linked to satisfaction with and motivation to use feedback. It's been associated with an interest in seeking feedback. In fact, employees who work within a favorable feedback environment oftentimes will ask their supervisor, how do you feel like I've been doing on this? Is there anything you'd like to see from me in the future? Those kinds of things well between appraisals. And people who experience a favorable feedback environment tend to display higher levels of organizational commitment, which is that thing I keep talking about, wanting to keep employees in place, good employees that are working well. We want them to have high levels of organizational commitment. Employees who are high on feedback orientation tend to seek feedback more often than those who are lower on feedback orientation. So if you take a person who's high in feedback orientation and are in a favorable feedback environment, you're going to have a person who really seeks out a lot of feedback, tries to change their behavior when it's still a small change to be made, rather than waiting 6 months or 12 months for their performance evaluation to find out that they've basically been doing it wrong or inefficiently or inadequately this whole time. So, of course, in the US, there's always going to be legal issues having to do with anything, right? So some legal issues in performance appraisal. It's illegal to discriminate in performance appraisal on the basis of non-performance related factors. And the ones that have been specifically designated are age, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and disability. So, that's a lot of different things that we have to make sure are not accidentally spilling over into performance appraisal or deliberately, right? Sometimes people are doing this stuff deliberately, but we need to make sure that we have good objective performance appraisals in place. And we want to really reduce those biases and errors that we talked about previously so that these topics do not leak into the performance appraisal process. So some legal recommendations for performance appraisal. Oh, I promised you every chapter I would manage to slip in job analysis, right? But we want to use job analysis to develop the criteria for what needs to be displayed by the employees, right? So that they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. We want to communicate performance standards in writing, like in the employee handbook or in some kind of job description that is, provided to the employee when they first start working. We want to develop multiple dimensions of performance so that we have different things that we could be analyzing in the same employee on the same basic topic, so that there's a chance that they could do well on part of it, but maybe need some work on another part of it, things like that, so that it's not just one big monolithic analysis of this giant thing called performance. We want to have a mix of objective criteria and subjective criteria on our performance appraisals. The objective to make sure that we're literally just counting up how many times they did this or that, how often or how much they do this other thing. And then we want to have some subjective criteria where we can actually sort of look at the nuances of this individual. We always want to, after a performance appraisal, give employees an access to an appeal so that they can say, I don't think that this performance appraisal correctly represents my performance, and here is my evidence. Here's my documentation that I didn't in fact miss that many days of work, or here's my documentation that I did in fact reach quota, or those kinds of things. So you want to make sure that employees have that opportunity. And then really, the more raters you can have, the better argument you can make that it couldn't have been due to a single person's bias that this employee was rated poorly. If multiple independent raters are seeing the behavior the same way, it's possible that the behavior actually is what it appears to be and it needs to be remediated or whatever. So documenting everything pertinent to personnel decisions. And then on the flip side, since you guys are students and probably the next thing you're going to do is, or maybe you're currently doing is your employees, document everything pertinent on personnel decisions about you. Like, keep all those records yourself. A lot of times we trust our employers and we don't keep track of our own hours or which days of the week we worked and things like that. And so if we were actually shorted on a paycheck, we might not even notice it. And so, keep a little calendar, write down what your work schedule was, like what days and times you actually worked. If you have any kind of, goof up, I was trying to think of a nice word, but goof up at work, document what happened and what led up to it, how you tried to remedy it, those kinds of things. And so that, if you needed to appeal a performance appraisal or, let's say a firing decision, you'd have your documentation just like they need to have their documentation. And then the last thing is to make sure to train raters or provide written instructions is even better, right? Rather than having a rater sort of have the gist of how to deliver the performance appraisal. What if you had like written instructions where they just did exactly, they either read the written instructions to the employee, or when they're doing their own rating, they literally just read the instructions and do what it says, limiting the opportunity for bias to emerge as an individual is imposing their interpretation of the message, right? So the more training or the more rigid the instructions are, the less likely that somebody can deviate and do something wrong. So therefore protecting the company. So I thought I'd provide you with a little evidence for the utility of these legal recommendations. There was a review of court decisions that had come down between 1980 and 1995, and then was reported by Werner and Bellino in 1997. And there were 300 Court of Appeals decisions related to performance appraisal. So, I mean, that's a lot. That's Court of Appeals. So that means that there were way more court cases, and then there were people attempting to appeal those cases, and that's what we're talking about here. 109 were related to age discrimination, 102 having to do with race discrimination, and 50 having to do with sex discrimination. So kind of broken down across the different major categories. Judgment was more likely made for the company when job analysis was used. So that's a good argument for using job analysis. When written instructions for performance appraisal were provided. So when it was really like clear, written down on the document that was going to be used for making ratings and things, exactly what the rater was supposed to do. Not only was it more likely that the rater actually followed the instructions, but now the judge could see in black and white, this is what they were instructed to do, right? So at the minimum, the company would be protected. Maybe the rater is left hanging for looking like they were biased, but the company had told them not to be biased because look, it's written down here in the written instructions. Judgment was more likely made for the company when employees had an opportunity to review their appraisals. So like I mentioned a couple of segments ago, the idea that an employee should get to look at their appraisal, get feedback from their appraisal, interact, participate in their appraisal, they're much more likely to be satisfied. And then it also implies that the company was more transparent. When multiple raters agreed on the performance ratings, the judgment was more likely to go in favor of the company. So again, instead of charging one supervisor with making the rating, have multiple angles of ratings. Could be a supervisor and a peer. It could be a supervisor and a customer. It could be, lots of different angles. It could be a supervisor and top management. It could be any pairings. Could be, in some workplaces, maybe more than one supervisor works with the same employees, so multiple supervisors. Just as long as it's more than one person doing the rating, it gets rid of the possibility that it's just like a unique bias. It also shows the company's effort to make sure that we're not trying to be biased. And then when we've trained our raters, right, any type of rater training boosts the likelihood that the company will be found not guilty of discrimination if they have attempted to train their raters. So even though some rater training seems to work better than others in actual, reduction of bias and stuff like that, just the idea of attempting to train your raters seems to protect the company from lawsuits, or at least from being found guilty in those lawsuits. So it seems worthwhile to go through this process because it seems like there are a lot of lawsuits that come from performance appraisals. So it would be worthwhile for companies to hire industrial and organizational psychologists to help them out with this process. All right. That concludes chapter 5. Hopefully by the time I come back for chapter 6, this cold or allergies or whatever's getting me will be gone, and I will see you guys then. All right.